There are some cases that disturb you because of the violence, and then there are cases that stay with you because they force you to confront something much more unsettling. What if the most dangerous person is already inside the home? Because this case is not only horrifying because a woman and her 2 little boys were murdered in their beds. It is horrifying because, from the outside, this family looked like the kind of family people envy. A nice suburban house, 2 smiling sons, a husband with a respectable job, a wife who seemed devoted to her family. A life that, on the surface, looked stable, safe, and completely ordinary. And maybe that is exactly what makes this story so chilling. Because what happened here did not begin with blood. It began with performance, with lies, with a full story being built before anyone even realized a crime was coming. This is the case of Christopher Coleman, a man convicted of murdering his wife, Sheri Coleman, and their 2 sons, Garrett and Gavin. And the deeper you go into this case, the more one thing becomes impossible to ignore. This was not just a family tragedy. This was a calculated destruction. On the morning of May 5th, 2009, in Columbia, Illinois, Christopher Coleman returned home from the gym and found what he would later describe as every husband and father's worst nightmare. His wife and children were not answering the phone. A neighbor, who also happened to be a police detective, went to check on the house. And within moments, this quiet neighborhood became the center of a murder investigation that would shake the entire community. When police entered the home, something felt wrong immediately. Not because of blood everywhere, not because of chaos, but because of what looked like a message. There was a smell of spray paint in the air. And there, inside the home, were words painted on the walls. Threatening words. Words meant to send a message. Words that seemed designed to make one thing very clear. This family had been targeted. And then police went upstairs. In the master bedroom, they found Sheri Coleman, dead. In one of the boys' rooms, they found Garrett. And in another bedroom, Gavin, a mother, 2 children. All dead inside the place where they should have been safest. All strangled. No matter how many cases you hear, that kind of scene is difficult to process. But what made this one even more disturbing was not only what happened, it was how it looked. Because this did not look like random violence. It looked arranged, almost theatrical, as if someone had not only committed murder, but wanted to control the way those murders would be understood. And to me, that is one of the darkest details in this entire case. Because when a crime scene feels like a message, you have to ask, who is the message really for? Is it for the victims? No. It is for police, for the public, for anyone who walks in and starts building a theory. And in this case, that theory had already been planted. Because before the murders, Christopher Coleman had already been telling police that his family was being threatened. He had received disturbing emails, then letters, then more direct warnings. The messages were escalating. And because Christopher worked as the head of security for well-known televangelist Joyce Meyer, the explanation initially seemed believable. Maybe someone obsessed with religion, maybe someone unstable, maybe someone angry enough to target a person connected to a public religious figure. At first, it did not sound impossible, and that is what makes this case so disturbing. Because the lie, if it was a lie, was not sloppy. It was clever. It had enough realism to make people hesitate, enough detail to distract, enough atmosphere to make investigators look outward instead of inward. And honestly, I think it is important to say this. When people later ask, how did anyone not immediately know it was him? I actually understand why police did not jump there instantly. Because if someone has spent months creating a false threat narrative, then the whole point is to shape what everyone believes when the worst finally happens. That is not panic. That is not improvisation. That is construction. And that distinction matters. Because one of the strongest feelings I have about Christopher Coleman in this case is not just that he was cruel. It is that he was deeply, deeply selfish. Not impulsive in the simple sense. Not just angry. Not just emotionally overwhelmed. Selfish. A man who, in my view, had become so consumed by what he wanted, what he felt, and what he believed he deserved, that everyone else around him became secondary. That includes his wife, and horrifyingly, that includes his children. And I think if you keep that in mind while looking at this case, a lot of what follows starts making much more sense. Because very quickly, police began noticing things that did not quite fit the image of a devastated husband and father. Christopher was emotional, yes, but there was something missing. Something investigators would later describe not as dramatic guilt or obvious deception, but as a lack of the kind of desperate human urgency you would expect. Because when someone's wife and children have just been murdered, most people are consumed by questions. What happened? Who did this? When? How? Why? Were they awake? Were they scared? That frantic collapse. That instinctive need to know everything. And according to investigators, something about Christopher's reaction felt off. Not because he was calm, not because he was too emotional, but because there was a strange absence of genuine curiosity and desperation. And when police start feeling that something is emotionally wrong, even before the evidence fully catches up, that feeling matters. Because in cases like this, instinct is often the first crack in the surface. And then another crack appeared. Christopher Coleman was having an affair. And not just some vague emotional side relationship. A serious affair. A hidden second life. The woman was Tara Lintz, someone connected to Sheri's past. And once police started learning the truth about that relationship, the case began to shift. Because now, investigators were no longer just asking who might hate Christopher from the outside. Now, they had to ask a much more uncomfortable question. What was really happening inside that marriage? And as that answer began to emerge, the perfect family image started collapsing very quickly. Friends of Sheri described a woman who was heartbroken, a woman who had discovered what her husband was doing, a woman who, despite that, was still trying to hold her family together. And that part of this story hits me hard, because I do not see Sheri as weak, and I do not like when people reduce women in these cases to being naive or blind. I think she was trying to save the life she had built, and a lot of women do that. A lot of people do that. They hold on longer than they should because they still love the person in front of them, or at least the version of that person they thought they knew. And that is one of the saddest truths in this case, because while Sheri may have been trying to save her marriage, Christopher, by that point, appears to have been imagining a completely different life. A new woman, a new future, a new beginning. And the more police learned, the more this stopped looking like a man trapped in emotional confusion, and started looking like a man who wanted out, but did not want to pay the price for leaving. And that, to me, is where this case gets truly ugly. Because this is not a story about a man torn apart by guilt and indecision. This is a story, in my opinion, about a man who wanted everything arranged in the way that benefited him most. He wanted the affair. He wanted the fantasy. He wanted the future. He wanted the image. He wanted the income. He wanted control. And what he did not want was inconvenience. Not divorce if it would cost him professionally. Not scandal. Not consequences. Not a messy collapse of the life he had built. And when someone becomes that committed to preserving their own comfort, image, and desire, other people can start becoming obstacles instead of loved ones. And that is the point in this story where, for me, it becomes truly terrifying. Because if that is what happened here, then this was not a crime driven by one explosive emotional moment. This was something colder, something more self-centered, something far more deliberate. And this is where the case begins to shift from tragedy into something much more sinister. Because once investigators pulled on the thread of the affair, the whole carefully constructed image around Christopher Coleman started unraveling. What police were seeing now was not just a grieving husband. It was a man living in two completely different realities at the same time. In one reality, he was the married father of two, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, working a respectable job, protecting a public religious figure, and presenting himself as a family man under threat. In the other reality, he was emotionally and physically invested in another woman, and more importantly, in another future. That difference matters because affairs, as awful as they are, do not automatically turn into murder. People cheat, people lie, people destroy marriages every day without becoming killers. So the real question is not simply, did he want someone else? The real question is, what was he willing to destroy in order to have that life? And in Christopher Coleman's case, the answer seems to be everything. Because according to the evidence, this was not just some flirtation or emotional escape. This was serious. Christopher and Tara were deeply entangled. They were talking constantly, sending intimate messages, exchanging photos and videos, making plans. Not vague, maybe one day plans. Real plans. And when you hear that, something becomes very obvious. Christopher Coleman was not just cheating on his wife, he was already psychologically leaving the life he had with her. And yet, at the same time, he was still physically inside it. Still sleeping in that house. Still eating dinner there. Still being dad. Still playing the role. And I think that is what makes this story so deeply disturbing. Because there is something very dark about a person who continues performing normal family life, while mentally standing somewhere else entirely. That split between what someone shows and what they truly are is often where the danger lives. And for me, Christopher Coleman does not come across as some tortured man torn apart by impossible choices. He comes across as a cold, selfish opportunist, a man who wanted the rewards of a new life without accepting the cost of ending the old one. And that is where motive becomes incredibly important, because the prosecution believed Christopher had become obsessed not only with Tara, but with the idea of escaping into a cleaner, more convenient future. Except there was a problem. A divorce could cost him, professionally, financially, socially. Because Christopher worked for Joyce Meyer Ministries, and according to testimony, adultery could have destroyed his standing there. That meant he was stuck, or at least that is how he may have seen it. He wanted Tara, he wanted out, but he did not want to lose the job, the income, the image, or the stability that came with his current life. And this is where I think the ugliness of his personality becomes impossible to ignore. Because normal people, when they feel trapped, eventually choose one painful truth. They confess, they separate, they divorce, they lose money, they face consequences. That is what adults do. That is what accountability looks like. But someone like Christopher, in my opinion, does not seem built for accountability. He seems built for self-preservation. And that is a dangerous kind of person, because a deeply selfish person does not ask, what is right? They ask, what gets me what I want with the least damage to me? And if that really was his internal logic, then the people around him were no longer family in the deepest sense. They were becoming barriers. And that is horrifying. Because once a person starts seeing loved ones as barriers instead of people, you are standing very close to evil. Now go back to the scene itself, because the more police examined the house, the more the outside intruder story began collapsing under its own weight. There was an open basement window. At first that sounds like evidence of a break-in, but the problem was, it did not look forced. It looked accessible. It looked available. And that is a huge difference. Because if your family has been receiving serious threats for months, why would there be vulnerable access points in the house? Why would the home not be fully secured? Why would the danger supposedly come from outside, but somehow enter so neatly? Then there was the surveillance equipment. Christopher had security cameras installed, which, in a case like this, should have been incredibly important. Except for one very convenient detail. The recording system was gone. Missing? Which is exactly the kind of thing that instantly raises suspicion. Because if an intruder entered that house, murdered 3 people, spray-painted messages, and somehow also knew to remove the recording equipment, that starts to feel less like random violence and more like inside knowledge. And then there were the injuries. Sheri had signs of a struggle. She had fought. The children, of course, had not in the same way, which suggests that whatever happened inside that house did not unfold as some fast, chaotic attack from a stranger who lost control. It suggests something more personal, more intimate, more direct. And then there were scratches on Christopher's arms. Small things matter in cases like this. Not because one scratch solves a murder, but because little physical details, when they sit beside lies and contradictions, begin to create a pattern, and patterns are what break cases open. Then came one of the biggest turning points of all, the threats themselves. Because once police dug deeper into the threatening emails and letters that had terrified the family and shaped the early theory of the case, something became very hard to ignore. Those threats did not lead outward. They led back inward, back toward Christopher. Investigators eventually discovered that the threatening emails had originated from his own laptop. And to me, that is one of the most psychologically damning parts of this entire story. Because that means we are not just looking at a man who may have committed murder and lied afterward. We are potentially looking at a man who was building the cover story before the murders even happened. And that is something much darker. That is not fear. That is strategy. That is narrative control. That is somebody trying to pre-write the explanation for a future crime. And honestly, when I think about that, I think it is one of the most disturbing things a person can do. Because it means the violence did not begin on the day the bodies were found. It began months earlier, with deception, with planning, with psychological setup. And when I hear people describe this case as a family tragedy, I understand why. But to me, it is not only tragedy, it is also performance. A horrible, calculated performance. And I think that is why this case is so hard to shake. Because even after the murders, Christopher did not seem to stop trying to control the story, and that, in my opinion, tells you exactly what kind of man he was. Not a man overwhelmed by grief, not a man collapsing under the consequences of some emotional disaster, but a man still, even then, trying to manage perception, still trying to shape what people believed, still centering himself. And that is why I keep coming back to the same word over and over again, ego. Because this case, to me, is not driven by mystery. It is driven by ego. The kind of ego that makes a person think their own wants matter more than other people's lives. The kind of ego that makes them believe they are entitled to a clean exit from a life they no longer want. The kind of ego that says, if reality doesn't work for me, I will create a new one. And that is exactly what this case starts to look like. A man trying to manufacture a new reality, a new future, a new identity, at the expense of the very people who trusted him most. And I think that is what makes him, in the deepest sense, so frightening. Not because he was wild, not because he was visibly unstable, but because he appears so chillingly normal. And sometimes that is the scariest kind of person of all. By the time Christopher Coleman went to trial in April 2011, nearly 2 years had passed since the murders. 2 years of grief, 2 years of suspicion, 2 years of a community waiting to hear, in a courtroom, whether the man they had watched mow his lawn, wave from the driveway, and play catch with his boys, was actually the one who had ended all 3 of their lives. And this is where cases like this become especially unsettling, because once you enter the courtroom, the story stops being just emotional. Now it has to become legal. Now everything has to be proven, not just suspected, not just felt, not just obvious. Proven, and that is always where things get uncomfortable in a case like this. Because emotionally, many people had already made up their minds. But legally, this was still a circumstantial case. There was no murder weapon. There was no eyewitness. There was no dramatic confession. And that matters. Because as much as I personally believe Christopher Coleman is guilty, I also think it is important to say this clearly. A person should be convicted because the evidence proves it, not because the story feels dark enough. And yet, sometimes, circumstantial evidence can be even more powerful than one dramatic piece of proof. Because when enough separate details all point in the same direction, they stop being coincidence, they become truth. That is exactly what happened here. The prosecution's argument was simple in structure, but devastating in meaning. Christopher Coleman wanted a different life. He wanted Tara. He wanted out of the marriage. But he did not want the financial, social, and professional consequences that would come with divorce and scandal. So instead of ending his marriage honestly, he eliminated the people standing in the way. And what makes that argument so horrifying is not only that it is believable, it is that it explains almost everything. The affair, the lies, the threats, the missing surveillance equipment, the staged messages, the scratches, the behavior, the performance, all of it. The prosecution also introduced testimony from Sheri's friends. And I think those women became incredibly important in this case, because when someone like Christopher is skilled at performance, the private reality behind closed doors often only survives in fragments. In little things, conversations, confessions, tears shared with friends. And according to those friends, Sheri had been hurting long before she was killed. She had reportedly told people that Christopher wanted out, that he was cruel to her, that he would say hurtful things, that what people saw on the outside was not what she was living inside the marriage. And I think that part matters a lot, because cases like this are often made more dangerous by one terrible social habit, believing appearances. If the house looks nice, if the family photos look good, if the husband seems calm, if the children are smiling, people assume the home is safe. But some of the most dangerous homes are the ones that look the most normal from the sidewalk. And I think this case is a brutal example of that, because from the outside, this family looked like a success story. Inside, it appears something had already gone deeply rotten. Then, the trial moved into one of the most explosive areas of all: motive. The jury heard about Tara, about the intensity of the relationship, about the plans, about the emotional investment, about the fantasy of a future waiting somewhere else. And I think this is where Christopher Coleman becomes especially transparent, because he did not come across as a man broken by emotional conflict. He came across as a man irritated by obstacles. And to me, that is a huge difference. One is human weakness, the other is moral emptiness. Then came the question of the threats. And this, in my opinion, is where the prosecution's case became truly devastating. Because if those threats had really come from some outside fanatic, some obsessed anti-religious stalker or violent extremist, then maybe Christopher was a husband and father caught in a nightmare. But if those threats came from him, then he was not caught in a nightmare. He was building one. And that distinction is everything. Because if he manufactured fear before the murders, then this was not panic. This was architecture. And I think that is one of the most chilling ideas in this entire case, that someone could be creating the emotional weather for a crime before the crime even happens. That he may have been laying the groundwork for people to one day say, well, of course this happened, they'd been threatened for months. That is not grief. That is manipulation. And frankly, it is the kind of manipulation that makes my skin crawl. Because it means that while his wife was sleeping in that house, while his children were living their little lives, while the neighborhood was carrying on as normal, he may already have been preparing the excuse. And if that is true, then what you are looking at is not just a killer. You are looking at a man who tried to write the script for how his own family would be remembered after he destroyed them. And that is evil. Not dramatic evil, not movie evil, real evil, quiet evil, domestic evil, the kind that lives in family homes and still says good morning. Now, one thing that is always important in a case like this is the defense, because even when the evidence feels overwhelming, a trial has to test it. And Christopher's attorneys did what defense attorneys are supposed to do. They attacked certainty. They questioned timing. They questioned the exact time of death. They questioned whether someone else could have had access to his computer. They questioned whether someone else could have entered the home. And I actually think it is important that they did, because justice should survive scrutiny. It should be able to stand up to attack. And in this case, the prosecution's theory did. But here's what I find fascinating. The jury did not immediately convict him. In fact, at first they struggled. And I think that is deeply human. Because no matter how much evidence you hear, there is something in people that resists the idea that a father could do this. especially to his own children. And I understand that, because I feel that resistance too. Even now, after hearing the evidence, after hearing the lies, after hearing the affair, after hearing about the staged threats, there is still a part of the human mind that wants to say, no, surely not this, surely not that. Because once you accept that this happened, you are forced to accept something much darker too, that sometimes the greatest danger to a child is not outside the home, it is inside it. And I think people hate that truth, because it destroys one of the most basic illusions we want to keep. That home equals safety, that family equals protection, that a father equals shelter. And in this case, if the prosecution was right, all of that collapsed. Then came one of the most striking moments in the jury room. Not some dramatic CSI breakthrough, not a hidden fingerprint, not a surprise confession, a date, a photograph, a contradiction. Jurors noticed that a photo of Christopher and Tara together had been taken earlier than the timeline Christopher had claimed for the affair. And for some jurors, that was the moment the whole thing snapped into place. Because suddenly, in black and white, they had proof that he was lying. Not just maybe lying, not possibly mistaken, lying. And once that happened, something fundamental changed. Because if he lied about when the affair began, what else was he lying about? And in a case built on patterns, that question is explosive. After 15 hours of deliberation, the verdict came back, guilty, on all 3 counts. And when that happened, the reaction outside the courthouse was immediate. People applauded, people cried, people exhaled, because this was not just a legal outcome. For many, it felt like a moral correction, a line drawn, a statement that even if evil can hide in a family home, it does not always get away with it. Christopher Coleman was sentenced to life in prison, and even after all of that, even after the verdict, even after the sentence, he still denied killing them. And honestly, that may be one of the most revealing details of all. Because some people lie to escape punishment, but some people lie because telling the truth would require them to face what they really are. And I think Christopher Coleman belongs in the second category, because to admit what he did would mean admitting not only murder, but the complete collapse of whatever humanity he still wants people to believe he possesses. And that brings me to the final thing I keep thinking about in this case. It is not just the violence, not just the betrayal, not just the children. It is the terrifying idea that a person can live beside you for years, sleep in the same bed, raise children with you, eat dinner with you, smile in photos with you, and still remain, in the deepest possible way, unknowable. That, to me, is the true horror of this story. Not only that Christopher Coleman may have murdered his wife and sons, but that Sheri likely never imagined the greatest threat to her life was already inside her own house. And maybe that is why this case stays with people, because it forces a deeply uncomfortable question. How well do we really know the people we trust most? How well do we know the people we build homes with? The people we marry? The people we call family? Because sometimes evil does not arrive like a stranger. Sometimes it arrives as a husband, as a father, as a man who still remembers to kiss his children goodnight. And that may be the most frightening truth of all.